Working Cows Podcast, episode 201.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Conry, host of the Working Cows Podcast, powered by the Global Ag Network, here with another episode for you guys. Very excited today to introduce you to a friend of mine. I have been pastoring a church here in western South Dakota, on the prairies of western South Dakota, called Prairie Home Church for 2.5 years now. It'll be 3 years in January. And this gentleman and his wife, who are going to join me today on the Working Cows Podcast, have been members of this church since, I'm guessing, the late 70s, maybe a little bit before that even. So I wanted to start a project, and it might end up developing into something more, we'll see, of just capturing some of the history of people who have been on the land for a long time, on the land that they're on now, or connected to the land through agriculture for a long time. And so this is going to be the first in that series with David and Janet Paul today. And they are a marvelous couple that I've gotten to know over the last couple of years and really enjoy them and count them as friends. And I appreciate them being willing to take the time to join me today on the Working Cows Podcast. So I've been recording these. I've got 2 of them recorded. I've got another one to do with different individuals, and so far they've all been done at their kitchen table, so we'll see how it goes from here on out. But I hope you enjoy this. I think it's a neat opportunity to capture some of this history. I told them this story before I started recording with them, that I sat down and had a wonderful conversation with an elderly saint one time, and he ended up living for a couple of years after that conversation, but that was the last lucid conversation I had with him. The first time I sat down with him was the last one, and I regretted many times since then not having a microphone to capture that history that he shared with me that day. So made it kind of a point to tackle this and to attempt to capture some of these histories and hopefully inspire others to do similar projects. But more on that later. For now, here's my interview with David and Janet Paul. Janet and David, thank you guys for agreeing to do this today. I appreciate the opportunity to invade your home with microphones and recording equipment and sit down with you.
Well, you're always welcome, Clay. Yeah, you're a good guest to have.
Appreciate that.
And this will be a brand new experience for us.
Yeah. Well, we've talked a little bit about it being scary, but I appreciate you being willing to do something scary. So I guess where I'd like to start is, David, you made a statement one time at family night at church that you noticed a marked change in agriculture in Iowa from the time you went away to the service to the time you came back. So when was that? What were those years? And then what were some of the changes you noticed?
I left Iowa in January of 1957, and I returned in 1960 in August. I was home briefly in between that twice on leave. Yes, much changed. The first thing that was real striking to me was the farmers gathering on Saturday night in the small town of Shelby, Iowa, which had a population of 400, but a surrounding community of a lot of people. And they brought their eggs, creams, and whatever on Saturday night to Shelby. In the summertime, they sat on the benches on the street, and they visited. As a kid, why, I look forward to my cousins coming, and we all went to the movie, 15 cents for the movie and a dime afterwards. And this social community vanished in that short period of time. I don't know. People say it was television. They built an interstate highway past Shelby, Iowa. So Omaha, Council Bluffs now was just minutes away, 30, 40 minutes. Our world changed. And the people basically that I knew close, they hadn't changed that much, but the social structure had. And Saturday night was not Saturday night anymore. So farming-wise was a gradual change, and in that about 4 years, there wasn't that much that changed. More change came later in the 1960s, and that had more to do with the closing of the Omaha stockyards, which was, I don't know if the right word is icon or what, but I grew up with the Omaha stockyards as a real focus in all the farm life of that area. Shelby County fed the most cattle in record numbers that went to Omaha stockyards. And as the stockyards era ended and the packing houses could no longer dump their waste in the Missouri River, they moved out and order buyers took their place. So the Omaha stockyards of the commission men and the alleys and the pens and that all vanished. And today there's only evidence of it is the huge brick exchange building, which is now just an office building. But the yards, the pens, the big feed yards, the massive packing houses, and that all changed. And so, and with it now, cattle feeding also changed. Iowa's not the best place to feed cattle. It worked well for feed supply, but did not have the climate. South Dakota is better cattle climate by far to feed cattle.
Is it too wet?
Too wet. The winters were a constant back and forth between freezing and thawing, and the lots were mud and frozen and mud and frozen. And with circle irrigation came in, and they moved to the high plains, and western Nebraska became the first real focus, and Texas, on top of the aquifers where all the water was. And that all changed. So I go back to Iowa now, and the landscape is changed. I was just there very recently, and it's just cornfields and bean fields. I mean, this time of year here at the 1st of August is beautiful, green and lush, but there's no hay fields right in the area that I came from at Shelby, Iowa. You hardly can find a hay field. There was no oats grown or any other crops. Just corn and beans. And the farms that used to have all the lots and hog feeders and all the livestock, chickens and turkeys and goats and you name it, they're all groomed and mowed, and flowers and an American flag and pretty white buildings of machine shed types. So there is no livestock in those. The livestock are in hogs or in confinement buildings, and cattle, very few, but are fed in feed yards, not large ones like Texas or Nebraska, but small ones. So I just have to say, a lot of change, but it's been a lot of years.
Do you think that was there a vibrant Main Street kind of in Shelby, Iowa back when you were a kid?
Yes. Yes, there was all the stores that you would find in any town, and you basically could live there without needing to go to Omaha. But today, a third of those buildings have been removed, and they've made little parks between them. The town became a bedroom community for workers out of Omaha. Also, a huge Menards distribution plant has been built there because of the interstate right there. And so, yeah, there's a big Flying J truck stop and a McDonald's and things this small town would have never imagined. So, yes.
Has Council Bluffs reached it yet, or is it growing in that direction?
It has not grown out towards us, no. Omaha has done the huge expansion to the west.
Right.
Council Bluffs has not had that much expansion, not nearly as Omaha.
Sure.
So whether that's a tax issue with Iowa against Nebraska or what it is, I'm not sure.
My friends in western Nebraska would not think that the taxes could be much worse than they are, but
yeah, so I hear it from Iowa too.
Yeah. Janet, what was your experience growing up? Where did you grow up? Was it near Shelby, or were you a ways away?
I'm a Nebraska farmer's
Oh,
daughter.
okay.
My address was Syracuse. I went to high school in Cook, and those towns are probably about 50 miles south of Omaha.
Okay. And was the agriculture similar in Nebraska as it was to Iowa? I mean, you were not very far geographically separated.
Oh, I think so. Dad raised corn, oats, some hay, and he was a cattle feeder. He fed fat cattle, and they were marketed in Omaha.
Do you remember when did the stockyards shut down? Do you remember?
In the 60s, late 60s. Yeah, by 1970s, in there some time it was all gone.
Right.
But it became hard to use for farmers in the late 60s, early 70s. The order buyers had moved out. And, well, I shouldn't say order buyers moved out. Order buyers became the way to market cattle for the packing houses that had left Omaha. And so the order buyer would come to the farm to bid on the cattle. And so the commission man would come out from Omaha, and for a while there was a tug of war between the two. But the packing house man could actually give you a price, and you could take it or leave it. The commission man could make promises, but he could not guarantee a price. And if he wasn't honest.
So do you remember, Janet, that when that shut down, you guys were married in the late 60s, is that right? Or
We were married in 64.
64, so
I graduated high school in 1960, and then I left to go to college, and then I got married. So 1960 was the end of my full-time at-home experience. I have 3 sisters, so Dad and Mom had 4 girls. He didn't train us in farming things. Our work was feed the chickens, gather the eggs, help Mom with the garden, and endless canning days. That was Mom's work, and she took it seriously and did it well.
yeah. I mean, that's a big piece, I think, of what's missing today. So much of our produce comes from a grocery store, and those people in those days, you guys, your experience was surviving off of what you could can out of the garden. Is that right?
Well, my sister likes to tell this story. She said, Mom, I think you really like to garden. You garden so big and you can so much. And she said, Mom answered her, well, I had to feed you. So she liked to garden and can, and she was good at it, but she considered it her job.
Yeah, it wasn't, stay-at-home mom wasn't just up with her feet, with her feet up drinking iced tea. There was a lot to get done to feed the family.
Oh, our farm women worked hard.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you, David, define a little bit for me that you're using a term commission man? Can you kind of tell me about the life cycle of a cow in those days, and who owned it? When did it change hands? How did it change hands? Where did it go in each step?
There weren't that many cows. The cows were basically connected with dairy. And yeah, as a kid, I milked cow before I went to school, and we milked cows when we came home from school. And cream truck came by, and the only really good part of that was that toward the end of our area, as my brother, 11 months younger, we got older, we got half the cream check. So every other cream check came every 2 weeks. It was left in a cream can. So yeah, that got to be a payday for us. But so producing the cow and calf thing and feeding the calf out wasn't the industry. The calves came from the west, and they came to Omaha on rail, and they came from western Nebraska, North and South Dakota, Idaho. And in those days, brands were important, and farmers, they wanted circle dot calves from out in western Nebraska, or they'd name some other brand, and mostly Hereford, lots and lots of Hereford. From South Dakota, more crossbred type cattle came down from there, and this had to do with the dairy industry mixed in with it. And then the farmers fed, and they fed 30 head, 40 head, whatever they bought each year, according to what they raised. They marketed a good share of their corn and oats and hay through the livestock. So a farmer would be more of a hog man, or he'd be a cattle man. Not many sheep. Sheep were more a 4-H thing. Mm-hmm. And so these cattle would be fed, and then they'd go to Omaha. Commission man would come out and pat the farmer on the back and tell him how good they were, and took the cattle and tell him that you need to feed them another 30 days or so, and make sure that the farmer was ready. And the commission man, Janet can tell you that, they would bring out a candy bar for the kids, or a pencil and a pad and this sort of thing. And there was a lot of PR mixed in with that. And it was a family traditions, too. The Paul family, my dad, his dad, my grandfather, was honored as a 50-year shipper to Omaha with a banquet, and they did it each year, and as you became eligible for a 50-year shipper award, why, they were honored, and it was something farmers looked forward to, and which my dad's generation didn't get to do it because it folded before their time came.
So I'll give a tip of the hat to Jeff Ramsire, who's a guy I've talked to in the past on the podcast, and he made a statement that I've quoted many times, and others have as well. He said that now the crop rotation in agriculture in a lot of these I states, Iowa, Indiana, Illinois, is corn, soybeans, Florida. They do their corn and they do their soybeans, and then they go to Florida for the winter. In your experience in that history, the cows were coming in the winter, and they were being fed the crops off of the farmland. Is that how that was?
Yeah,
working?
When these calves came in, and you either took them out of the yards there at Omaha and brought them out, and we put them in the stock fields, and actually would feed them in the stock fields till winter set in, and it depending on how soon snow came or if it ever did. But where we were at, snow never stayed all winter. It came and went and came and went. But there'd come a time, and it depended on whether you chopped silage or you didn't, of how soon you yarded it. But you're only talking about anyway, probably from 30 to 100 head was pretty big for one farmer, because he farmed somewhere between 160 to 240 was pretty average up and down the road, and he could feed about so many cattle in that. And then here and there was a farmer that fed 200 or 300, and he bought corn and he bought hay from other farmers that didn't use it. And so there was a variety.
Sure. So were they coming in as balling calves then?
They came in as balling calves mostly, yeah.
But they came off of a ranch in the west. They'd come to the Omaha stockyards.
Yep.
Then the farmer would pick them up at Omaha, take them to his place, 30 to 100 at a time, and feed them for the winter. And then where would they go from there?
Along about midsummer, they would be ready to market.
Finished.
Yeah.
Okay.
Depending whether it's heifers or steers.
Sure.
And that was pretty big day for the family to go to Omaha and see the cattle sell. And as this town where I grew up, Shelby, Iowa, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday were the livestock days at Omaha. Thursday, Friday was just catch-up trade of cows and some other things. But so Monday was the big one, and everybody was glued to their radios on radio station WW to hear the market. And in those days, a nickel up or down, that was significant.
Right.
And so what that cattle price was, and of course this, I can't say his name, but there was a radio announcer that was very, very popular, and he gave the Omaha Stockyards report. And so along about Sunday evening, the trucks began to roll. And these were local truckers in town, hauled most of the livestock. And our family, we hauled our own. But they would just trucks, and into Omaha and back, and into Omaha and back. And
yep.
So,
it was trucks. That was gonna be my next question. Was it rail cars back to Omaha, or it was all trucks?
It was all trucks.
Yeah. Those rail cars are kind of hard to get going the other direction.
Well,
they like to go one direction, not two.
There was a period of time in that area in the late 1800s where there were rail stops, and nowhere in Iowa were you more than 8 miles from a railroad, no matter where you stood.
Wow.
And on the railroad, there were loading spots all over. And I did not witness this. This was before my time. But the farmer and his neighbors would gather the hogs or cattle and drive them across the fields or on the roads to this spot, and at a certain time to load them on the trains. And then they would be taken to Omaha. But I could hardly imagine driving pigs, but they did. They did.
Yeah. So you said that a nickel was significant. Is that a nickel per hundredweight?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. The price didn't change much.
Right. Now we talk in dollars per hundredweight.
Yeah. But as years, my experience was in 1951, the cattle market went down and down, and I saw neighbors and relatives feed 2 corn crops to cattle until these cattle were so big that they could not be killed in Omaha.
Wow.
And they were hauled to Chicago. And it was a bad day in farming for many of these, and lost their place. They couldn't come out on these cattle, and it seemed like it happened again in the early 60s, and we did it over again. And even up into the early 70s, it happened again. Seemed like every 11 years.
Yep.
Yeah, and then I think maybe in the 70s, it was when they put the freeze on. President Nixon announced a freeze of prices. Well, that killed the industry for a period of time. But these things always come and go.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate that history because I think in my history of interviewing people, the farthest we've gone back for a drop in price was 1973. And so it's good to get that longer term perspective.
Yeah, it started before that.
Yeah, yep. And it's been happening. It's a cycle.
It will again.
They call it the cattle cycle for a reason, right?
Yeah.
Janet, do you have any thoughts or perspective on anything that we've talked about there as far as things that stuck out to you from your experience in growing up in Nebraska?
Well, Dad loved feeding cattle. He did also have hogs, ran with the cattle. And I believe he was a good cattle feeder. I don't know how many he had. You might know, David.
He fed up to, I suppose at one time towards the end there when he quit farming and just fed cattle. And he had bought an abandoned missile base and turned it into a small feed yard. And he probably fed over 200 then. When we were first married, I would go with her dad and his brother, Uncle Hank, to Kansas. And we bought feeder cattle in Kansas. And I did that for just 2 years, I think. I may have been 3. But I fed heifers more, and the Kansas rancher didn't take his bulls out. He calved year-round because he could in the weather.
Yeah.
And these heifers, and we had to abort them, and that was not a good plan. It did not work well. And so I made a change then and started going up into this country in South Dakota, around Mulbridge area, to buy feeder cattle. So, but the last cattle that I got on the rail would have been about the end of the 1960s. And those cattle came from Idaho and came into Rosalie, Nebraska. And then Wahoo, Nebraska also, I received cattle on the rail. And these I bought in conjunction with my brother-in-law and his brothers. I had not actually done the buying myself or made the arrangements. My brother-in-law, Larry, would tell me when the calves were coming, and I would have trucks there to receive them.
Sure.
But that was the end of an era. The railroads did not want to ship cattle anymore. And yeah, we would get there, and one instance there, I was short one load. Well, the explanation was that the railroad car had developed a hot bearing on an axle, and the cattle had been unloaded, and they weren't even sure where, and they weren't sure when they would come. This sort of thing.
How many on a car usually?
I don't remember how many could put on a car. No.
I'm sorry to keep going back to this, but it's fascinating history to me. That the commission man, who was he employed by?
He was a commission firm, and the commission firm that the Paul family dealt with from my grandfather on was called Martin Brothers, and these people were. I don't know how you want to explain that. When my grandparents had their 50th wedding anniversary, Martin Brothers came to their 50th wedding anniversary. And I mean, for my grandparents and my dad and his brothers, I mean, they felt really honored that these men came out from Omaha and attended this open house wedding anniversary. It was quite important to them. And so they would have never considered selling to using any other firm to market their cattle or hogs.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd like to hear both of your perspectives on the issue of diversity as far as, like you mentioned, it's corn and soybeans now, pretty much. Was there kind of I've heard the history. I've never talked to anybody who actually farmed this way, I don't think, but I've heard the history of a 7-year crop rotation where you'd have like 3 years of alfalfa and then corn and then soybeans and then oats and then something else. Did you ever have any experience with that?
There was a norm in that was the accepted way to farm. The thing that changed, there was several of them. I started farming in 1962. 62. I did not stay in college only 3 semesters, a year and 1 semester next year. And then I had opportunity to lease a farm, so I left college and became farming. And it was I raised oats and hay and the other things, and I wanted to feed cattle. The bank was a local family-owned bank, and there, where my father had a good reputation, I could go there and borrow money. I grew up with friends that could not, because of their father had not ever been successful. He was either a hired man or whatever, which seems unfair, but that's the way it was. And basically, I would go in the fall and show what corn I would have, what hay I had on hand, and if I had the feed on hand, he would allow me to buy so many calves. But it was a pretty stringent operating funds to get one place, but it didn't take much. The government program they had for raising corn was set-aside acres, and they paid that in August. And for all the input that I spent in putting in a crop, nobody asked me for any money for that until I got that government payment. Or on the cattle side of it, I was never asked for commercial feed to be paid for or anything else. We paid our bills at the end of the year.
Right.
And nobody charged interest. Everybody operated that way.
Wow.
And so that was kind of a norm. The thing that radically changed then as we got going in the 60s was that we were, it was $80 to $1 a bushel corn. And that's why it was all fed to livestock mostly. Well, there was a Secretary of Agriculture by the name of Earl Butz. He went to Russia and made a deal with them to buy corn. And corn went to $3.50 a bushel. I mean, it changed everything.
Wow.
And soybeans at one point right there reached 15. Well, that all disappeared, but it's now back all these years later again, 45 years later or whatever it's been, 50. But with that also came a chemical called atrazine. And we could now spray down atrazine and just raise corn on corn.
Right.
And Buffalo Till, I think it was just maybe called the Buffalo Company out in Nebraska, built a minimum till planter. And from the moment I saw the first one, I hated to plow. This getting on an M-Farmo with a 3-bottom plow and sitting on that thing all day long to plow 10 acres, just my mind couldn't stand that. But I could take this Buffalo Till planter and rip down through the old rows and put seed in the ground and spray down atrazine, and not a weed came up. But there was issues with it. We had to make it work, but we could farm twice as much, 3 times as much, and we did.
Yeah. Was there a lot of consolidation that happened then?
The thing that was, we had a Depression-era population there that had saw the prices of the Depression. Now these people were retirement age and older, and land now came back up to $350 to $400 an acre, and these people, and that was what it was in the late 1920s before the 30s came. And here it was back again, and they were ready to sell. The thing about those people were that as we bought farms from them, and these were small farms, 80 acres, 120, 160. The largest one we bought was a 240. And as these people sold them to us for contract for deed, and they were more concerned about us paying for them than we were. They offered us terms of years of even not having to make a payment. And yeah.
They couldn't see how you were going to make that work.
No, because they had saw that price before and it collapsed.
Right.
And so they were very concerned. But we were young and they wanted to sell it to us.
Yeah.
And so, and we sure wanted to buy it.
And now land in Iowa is $10,000 an acre?
Oh, yeah, you name it.
Right. And so do you have a perspective on that? Is that just a correction in the market waiting to happen, or what do you think? No,
it's there for now. Money isn't worth anything. So young men will ask us about what to do going down the road, and I'd say, your years are totally different than my years. I cannot draw from my years to tell you what to do in your years, because you will just have to live them. And money today has no value, and so to make it produce something, you have to buy something productive. And bank accounts are not productive. No, the changing of time has always been, there was two things that my dad came to me and really was not happy with the way I was doing things. And he bought seed corn for $5 a bushel from a local grower. And he planted that, and he got 80 bushel to an acre corn, right. Somewhere in there. And the worst part of that is a portion of that seed corn didn't hold its ears, and part of that corn dropped on the ground before the harvester could get to it. And I paid $30 a bushel to Pioneer seed corn and sowed it in the ground rather than planted it from hill to hill. He just let me know that I planted corn too thick and it would not work. And the other thing that he was really unhappy was I did not save money. Well, money being saved didn't earn anything. And I had no reason yet in my life to save money. And so I borrowed money. And he had a small farm, and he was a good farmer. But my mother didn't want him to, they had 120 acres, and my mother did not want to buy land because her parents had lost their land.
Right.
And she wanted to spend their money. So they did travel. Dad rented land. He rented 2 more small farms, and he worked hard, and he was a good farmer for that day. But so they did travel. They enjoyed life.
Good.
So,
yeah. I want to switch gears a little bit, and Janet, if you know any of the history of how your family came to be connected to land in Cook, Nebraska, or in that area, Syracuse, Nebraska, could you tell me about how that happened, if you know it?
My dad's father was an immigrant from Germany, and he liked it so much. He had brothers and sisters, anyway, relatives that came also. My dad's mom was fully German, complete with the language, but right. She was an American citizen, not an immigrant. My dad's dad, in fact, paid for his parents to come across, and they did not like it. So then he paid their fare to go back home to Germany. And Dad said sometimes that made it hard for my dad to get ahead because he had spent all that money. And he did not have, you might say, family backing to help him. And neither did my dad, because his dad died when Dad was 19 years old.
So did they land? I mean, they came to America and then straight to Nebraska, or was there a process? Do you know?
I wish I knew, but I do not know about his dad, what the history of coming was.
Sure. So, but your dad grew up in Syracuse, is that right?
My dad grew up near Sterling, Nebraska, and Cook, Nebraska.
Okay. What about you, David? Do you know the history of the Pauls in Iowa?
The name comes from Scotland, and I've got cousins that traced it back as far as they can. But basically, myself, I'm far more English. My mother was full English on both sides of her family, and Dad's my grandmother Paul was Danish, and then Dad, my great grandfather John Paul was yeah, they had been in the country for quite a while. So whether he was full blood Scottish, I don't know. But so by the time I come along, yeah, I'm only a part Scottish, but I do claim the Scottish. I like that part.
Yeah, that's me too with my Irish.
Yeah,
Connery is an Irish last name. So
yeah, but they kind of worked their way across from what my cousins could trace back somewhere from in Illinois to southeastern Iowa, and then my great grandfather moved. He bought land from the railroad in 1869 or 70 when they built the railroad into that area. And he came west then and bought land from the railroad and built a farm. And my grandfather was 2 years old when they came. And yeah, my grandfather lived on that farm till he was 70. So, no, yeah, well, past 70. He was on that farm 70 years.
Wow.
So, yeah. And my brother is there today. So the buildings, some of the old buildings are still there, but otherwise my brother has, built a new home and these sort of things.
Sure. Your brother would be the third generation there then?
Yeah, great, and then fourth generation.
Fourth generation, wow.
Great-grandfather, grandfather,
Yep.
dad, fourth. Yep. Fourth
Does he have any kids there?
My brother has two daughters. Neither one live there.
Okay.
No, so there won't be another Paul generation on there. So,
Gotcha.
yeah, out of 16 of us cousins, there was only 4 boys, and so the rest were all girls.
Yeah.
And so my brother and I, and then each of my dad's 2 brothers, they each had 1 son, and one of them farmed, the other one does not. So.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your shared history. You married in 1964, Janet. What was early married life like in mid 1960s Iowa? Right? You were still in Shelby.
Shelby.
Yeah.
We were there. How many years? 13, 11.
I think about 12 years, so 11 or 13.
Somewhere in there. Take the average.
We farmed there 13 years before we came to Dakotas.
Sure. What was the early married life like in mid 1960s Iowa?
We were happy. We didn't have any money. He said, "Don't spend any money. We don't have any." But we always had plenty to eat. We always had plenty for our needs. And I would say we lived quietly, but so did our friends. We were happy. And when it came eventually to buying the farms, I just remember not being afraid. We didn't have anything. We didn't have anything to lose. And we were happy.
A little more history on that. Janet taught school for 1.5 years. And in that, we saved every bit that she made. So we did save some money, but we had $5,000. And so that's what we used for the down payment on that first farm. And I bought it with my brother, and yeah, he borrowed the money from my dad. But yeah, that we were renting a farm. Our landlord was from North Platte, Nebraska. No, originally it was his mother, older woman in Omaha. She had been in, her history went back to this farm as a family farm. And so she leased it to us, but we were required to live in the house. The house was 1800s something, and yeah, when the wind blew, you could look at the curtains and see which direction it was coming from. Yeah, it was pretty near impossible to heat at times. But she died the first year. She only saw the first corn crop that I raised, and she was thrilled. The farm had been rented for years and years, 40 years or so, and somehow she seemed to get the poorest farmers, and they didn't buy fertilizer and that. I didn't really realize it. I attended the ag meetings and what have you, and it was a share crop, and I went out and put a crop in, and when she got her bill, she came to see me. But she came back in the fall, and the corn crib didn't even begin to hold the crop.
Right.
And there was a big pile on the outside. We filled both sides of the crib. We filled the alleyway of the crib, and we had a big pile outside. But she died that winter. And then her son, the Ford dealer at North Platte, Nebraska, he came, and he was totally a businessman.
Sure.
He had no strings tied to that farm. Outside, it was a dye farm, and but he was, being a businessman, for me, I felt he was the easiest man to deal with ever. We didn't deal with personalities and attitudes and anything else, just business. And he looked at the lease. He says, shows the lease that you're renting 7 acres of the buildings, and you pay $10 an acre for that 7 acres. He said, I'll tell you what, I won't charge you anything for that 10 acres and those buildings and that, but don't send me any bills either. So, it was very plain to see the $70 would hardly cover a screen door.
Right.
And so, and we shared cropped. He never did ask cash rent. So I never had to come up with cash rent. We farmed that farm those 13 years. When I told him I was going to Nebraska, he said, find me a good renter. I leased it to my cousin, and my cousin farmed it the rest of his life, and then his son farmed it.
Wow.
But Joe had died, and then the kids turned it over to a land management company, and they put the lease up for bid.
Sure.
For cash. And that in it. But 40 years of myself and my cousin farming that farm.
Wow. Did you ever hear what the cash bid was when it went for rent?
The cash bid was, I think, I'd heard it was more than the farm would have had to pay for that farm. I think it was more than $400 was the cash bid per acre. Yeah. And that farm, when I was farming it, $400 an acre would have bought it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. What you were going to say something there, Janet?
Oh, he said we went to Nebraska when he meant we went to South Dakota.
Okay, I was wondering if there was a stop in Nebraska there I wasn't aware of.
No, okay.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. What led to the transition here? What brought you to this area?
I guess you'd have to read a story that I heard. It started way back. Yeah.
Is this in the book that you're working on?
Yeah, it will be in the book. Yeah.
Okay.
And the book will be titled Air Castles. And that's the first Janet Snowden book it's going to be called. But
we're breaking news here.
I've thought it, but that's the name the book should have, Air Castles. And that goes back to a time I didn't live at home. After I turned 16, I went to work for a farmer, and my brother was more help than my dad needed for his farm. Sure. So I went to work and went what high school I did then. But that summer, and I don't know if you want to go into stories.
Yeah. Well, anything you
Well,
want to
you
share.
can
And
delete, I guess.
you guys, your schedule is the only one I'm worried about. So if you want to go longer, you keep going.
Well, one day Ernie got a call, and a man from South Dakota, a rancher, had bought some bulls. Well, his son had actually bought them, and his son was a doctor and lived at Irwin, Iowa, and they were shirt-tail relatives. And this man then contacted Ernie to haul these 6 bulls up to South Dakota, and Ernie had a straight truck, and that would be a nice load for it, and Ernie agreed to do that. And so then they debated around whether Ernie and Kay, the wife, would go and I would chore, but then Kay was concerned with that, and one thing and another. Finally, it was decided that Ernie and I would go, and Kay and Ernie's dad would do the chores. So the day came, and we were up before dawn, and of course this wasn't new for Ernie. He started every day in the dark and practically ended them in the dark. But we went up to Irwin, Iowa, and loaded these bulls, drove all day, and in the evening we came in by Fort Thompson and to a ranch. And this ranch was 30,000 acres. Had 3 cow herds on it, an Angus, Hereford, and a Shorthorn.
Wow.
And so the rancher was 90 years old, tall and slim. And so we unloaded the bulls, and then we followed the son to the place and stayed overnight with the dad and his Indian housekeeper. Now, there was also a son there that was disabled, handicapped. He had been kicked in the head as a child by a horse. And so he did not communicate, but the Indian housekeeper cared for him. He came, sat at the table, but never said a word, this sort of thing. But the next morning, Ernie, of course, is ready to get back to Iowa and get to work, but the rancher insists that we have to go out for a tour. And I've learned since that's custom. Yeah.
Sure.
And so he had a Plymouth High Drive that all you did was he just had one gear and you push down on that foot feet, and the harder he pushed, the faster it went. And so we went off, and we're going across pastures, and there's cows, and we come by hay fields where men were stacking hay, and he was just chattering, talking to Ernie, and I sat between them. And so I'm 16, and I'm about yay tall, and he's up here, and Ernie's up here, and I'm the kid in the middle. And Ernie would open the gates and close the gates as we came to them, and we come to a gate, and I'm sitting there, and this rancher, while Ernie's opening the gate, he turns to me, looks down at me, and he says, "Building air castles, Sonny?" And I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. I didn't really understand right away. And he says, "You go on, build them. This is a country to build them in."
Huh.
And, that never left me. Yeah. So
there was a pull to this.
Yeah, and I felt, as we came here, there was the Lord's hand within that. And I think it started way back then. But that thought never left. I went to the service, Japan, China, everywhere else, and went back to Iowa and farmed, but that never left me.
And can you define the term air castles?
You build a dream.
Yeah.
Yes. And, as our children came, and I looked at the kids, and I looked at those boys, Iowa wasn't where we belonged. No. And between that, when I started buying calves up in the Dakota, this old German would take me out from Mobridge. And again, we came out to the ranches. And each year, as I left, I'd come up in the late summer, and Ernie would take me, or Henry would take me from ranch to ranch, and we'd bid on calves. And and there was no telephones, and so those ranchers would come in the evening to Mobridge, and then we would meet them in a cafe, and they had to talk to Mom, and they had to talk to Aunt Lucy, and they had to, these ranch families.
Yeah.
And then we'd come to terms on the calves, but there was just something about those people and the ranches out West River. Mm-hmm. And my son Daniel now today owns the ranch that Henry Munderloh had out there West River. And we always stopped at his ranch.
Yeah.
And so...
If Fort Thompson is south of Pierre, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right on the river.
South of Pierre on the east. Well, if you go over to, Bill's Corner, they're going to Sunshine.
Right.
If you go south from there, you come to Fort Thompson.
Yeah.
And today, I cannot tell you where that ranch was at. And what I kind of remember was that ranch, when this man died, was eventually sold to Fluhoff Trailer Company, I think. A large trucking trailer manufacturer, I think, may have bought that ranch. But I think it was on Indian land, too. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
So
when I was looking for a change of scenery, sometimes driving home from Sunshine, I would go through Fort Thompson.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, I know the area a little bit, but I was just trying to give context to people listening and where exactly that was at.
Yeah. For me to take you to where that ranch was, at 16 to today, I could not.
Right.
No.
Sure. Janet, what was the perspective of people in Iowa of the West or Western South Dakota? What do you have anything to say about that?
There was a party for us before we left, a going away party, and there was some emphasis on I think they gave us a toy gun because we would surely need a gun, and
sand bucket.
I did not want to leave.
Iowa.
No.
Right.
I was quiet, and it took me a while to get acquainted, and I had little kids, and I was busy, and I did not want to leave, but I did.
You had 4 of the 5, is that right?
4. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They were born in Iowa.
They were ages 9 to 4 when we moved.
And you guys, the first place you landed was East of Faith, is that right? Or
I did. I came up January 1st of 1976 and started taking in cattle. This arrangement came together with my brother-in-law, who at that time operated the Oshkosh Feed Yard at Oshkosh, Nebraska. And so we put together a deal of backgrounding calves for the feed yard. And so we bought 15,000 acres and leased another 10,000 acres east of Faith. And on January 1st there, I started a month's process of bringing in 4,500 calves and dispersing them to be winter fed. And there was feed on the ranches that we bought turnkey, and machinery and feed. And so that's where we began then, with background in these calves. And that program worked well for 2 years, partly into the third year, and the cattle market went south, and our cattle feeders backed away from buying so many calves, and so then we turned to cows.
Sure.
So,
was the house at Marine the first one that you guys moved into?
It was the first one, and that is important to me, what I was thinking.
Yeah.
David had told me it was a nice house, a pretty place. We spent the whole day driving there, and when I walked into the house in the dark of the night, I thought, this is a nice house. And I was quite interested, some months later, when somebody came to see us from Iowa. Andy?
Yeah.
His first comment when he walked in the door was, this is a nice house. I think we both really expected a shack and a path.
Right. Yeah. And why was land moving then? I mean, I guess land is always moving, but was there any kind of a market or anything historic happening that caused, that amount of land to be for sale at that time?
It was owned by Ted Jennings, who was a large operator over by Highmore, the Jennings brothers. And they bought and sold. And out here it was known as the Marks Ranch, been put together by a man named Bert Marks. And so this Ted Jennings had bought it when Bert Marks passed away, and he held it 10 years. He sold it after he bought it, and then ended up buying it back again, or maybe he kind of got it repossessed again, and then put it up for sale again. And that's where we found it. Land was going up. Our original coming to South Dakota was going to be with the Henry Munderloh, the one from up at Mobridge. He leased that place that he had, and he came to Iowa to see me. And I mentioned to him that when he told me then that he had leased his place, he had a hired man on it ahead of that, and he ran yearlings on it. And I said, boy, Henry, if I had known you were going to lease that, I would have liked to lease that from you. And he said, would you like to move to South Dakota? And I said, yes. And no more was said than that. Well, 6 months later, he called me and he told me, I'm going to buy a ranch. Do you want to lease that? You come up and look at it. And so I did, and we made arrangements to do that. But in the process of him buying that, it fell through, and it was never purchased. Well, so then the thought didn't leave, but then my brother-in-law put this deal together, and then we came. Mm-hmm.
So you said that 1976 you came. The cattle feeding worked well for about 2 years, maybe into the third year. Well, that puts us into 1978, 79, right on the front of the 1980s farm crisis. Was there, and I don't want to skip too many stories here, but can you share with me some of your perspective on that and what your experience going through that was?
Those had some weather in those years. We had one of the toughest winters we ever had. We had a 5-day blizzard that just really devastated this country. In that period of time, and we had dry times in that. But in those years, I suppose the biggest element in that was from 76 till October of 80. That's how long my brother-in-law lived. And he had his first heart attack just months after we engaged into this project. And then through the heart condition, that was a back and forth deal. And eventually in October of 80, he died. And so then it was my sister and I. And and then we're into the 80s far enough pretty quick that, the financial end of it, the high interest rates, So she needed to withdraw to Nebraska and hold things together. And she did a tremendous job of keeping my brother-in-law had bought land all over in Nebraska, farmland, and it was involved in feed yards and everything else. But she was able to salvage out of that a pretty good chunk. So some of it, she got rid of the airplane and some of the other stuff right away. But and so then we had opportunities come our way. They were a mixed bag of one thing and another. That came and went with us. But I guess the farm crisis itself, that you couldn't sidestep that. I mean, the bank industry came down hard, and they wanted the high interest rates, and if you couldn't do it, they wanted to repossess everything. And I guess I was never afraid of it. I didn't have any trouble facing it for the fact that when we sat down with them, my statement to them was, there's two sides to this desk, and there was two partners in this operation, you and me. And this deal hasn't worked. And yeah, both of us are going to take a bump out of this. And we never backed off from that. Yeah, they had their lawyers, and Federal Land Bank was where and Production Credit it was then, So, yeah, Janet and I sat at this desk with the other side there, the banker and the lawyer, and yeah, I said, this is not my fault that we gathered here today.
Right.
So, yeah, I would say that I felt blessed from some help beyond in many ways. But we negotiated our way through it, and a man in Montana, Tom Lane, came along who I'd run cattle for him, and yeah, we sold out the cows complete, and yeah, the Production Credit, they had a mortgage on them. Here they are. We did not have any mortgage on our equipment, so they could not foreclose on our equipment, therefore they couldn't shut us down, and they did not have a lien on the land because that was under Federal Land Bank, which was separate at that time. Today it's all under Farm Credit System, but then it wasn't. So Production Credit had operating money and livestock and machinery, but we didn't have anything borrowed on our machinery. And so, and we wouldn't let them, they tried at the end, they wanted to combine everything under a new. And I could see that what they were, this was not going to work because then they would bind our machinery and our land. And so, anyway, the man in Federal Land Bank in Rapid, which we were approaching 2 years behind on our payment, I really felt blessed by him. He had the attitude, too, that you guys didn't create this. It was more created by them than it was us. And he said, he looked at it, he says, he said, you have a good chance to receive an SBA loan. And he said, you work on that. He said, your loan is going in my bottom drawer, and I'm going to lose it. He said 6 months. And in that 6 months, we did secure the emergency loan and was able to catch our payments up. In that same time period, Production Credit, they went under. And when they went under, finally, and filed bankruptcy, then, yeah, they were pushing us hard, but they did not want us in bankruptcy. They already had too many, and they couldn't deal with the bankruptcies. So it was a stalemate for a little while there. And then they went under, then we negotiated, and yeah, they took the lump and I took a lump, and we got going again. Because I had a cash flow from Tom Lane, I filled the ranch with his cattle, and he ran yearlings and calves, sent them to me, and I would graze them or winter feed them for him, and when they were ready, he sent them on to Nebraska and Kansas. Well, mostly Kansas, yeah. And he told me from the beginning, he said, it doesn't cost me a dime more or less to drop the cattle at your ranch and then reload them and take them on to Kansas. He said there's no extra expense in doing that. So anytime you have feed, grass, you let me know, and I'll send you cattle. And that's where the cash flow come from. No bank would loan us anything. And this was typical in the whole country. So, but, and amazingly, years later, they're calling us wanting our business. But yeah, they didn't at that time. But there is one little note in that the man that ran this production credit at Lemon, he, of course, was fired, when they folded, what have you. And we were in Belle Fourche, several years later, and I can't tell you what time period that might have been. He had went to Belle. His wife opened a used place or used clothing stuff called the Bottom Drawer or something there in Belle, and he worked with some people and made a realty company and management company called Help You Sell, Help You Rent, and they put that together. Well, I'm sorry I can't tell you his name, but we were in Lynn's Super Value in Belle Fourche one day, and I ran into him, and he says, "David, have you got time for a cup of coffee?" And I said, "Sure." So she's shopping, so we went in the little deli area and sat down, and he said, I really want to apologize for what we did. He says,
Wow.
He said, "We did it to you." He said, and I don't remember, he had some other words to that, but he really felt that he needed to apologize for, he said, "We created that. You didn't." And
Is this the guy that said, "I will lose your loan in my bottom"?
that was Federal Land Bank.
In Rapid. Okay.
Yeah. And basically that took a hit too. And I know he left Federal Land Bank when they reshuffled. They fired everybody and brought in all new people. And it was under Omaha was the main office. And so the Rapid office too, with their building there. In fact, I think even the building closed. But he went to Texas, and he worked for maybe Cummins Diesel or something. He got an executive job, but he was good. He was good, and there again, it wasn't his doings,
Right.
But
Production credit would have been the people who had the mortgage on the cows. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And you ended up doing a complete dispersion because they were calling the note.
Right.
Yeah.
We did completely disperse.
Right.
So
the place at Marine, where John is still, you had that and the place near Faith.
Okay, when we came, my brother-in-law bought the place at Marine.
Okay.
And I bought the land by Faith. Yeah, there was a little over 8,000 acres at Marine, and there was 7,000 acres over there.
Sure.
And that's the way we bought it.
Gotcha.
And we had separate loans on it. Barb. So when we came down to the farm crisis, and Barb turned the ranch back to Federal Land Bank at Marine, I kept mine yet. I had land in Iowa yet, and my brother helped me through that by putting together a loan for me until we got that land sold down there. And so we got through it there on that side, plus the emergency loan that was given to us for 3 years, And then then they graduated me, and I had to repay it. But, the interest at, I don't know, 2 or 3% or something, made the difference from 15%.
Right.
Yeah. So, that all worked out well. But so then Barb sat down with Federal Land Bank, and she said, "Okay, I'll give you this farm. You take it back, but I'm keeping this one. And you can have this, but I'm keeping this. And you can have the ranch, but I'm keeping this." And she was able to deal with them enough so that the land that she kept cash flowed, and she made it.
Wow.
So, but the ranch then, she added one little statement. She'd give it back to them, but they had to lease it to me. And they basically leased me that ranch for I think I paid $3 an acre for it. And I had it for 2.5 years, I think. And all that time, they had it for sale. and there was never a buyer came to look at it. The people that had money, they didn't want to put it in ranching because they were drawing 15% interest on a CD. And so nobody came to look at it. Land just did not sell. This place down here, close to me here, was the lowest I know of. It brought $25 an acre. Larry had given $100 for that marine ranch, and they asked $70 for it. And in the end, they came and looked at it again. And the man in Rapid that I dealt with at the farm Federal Land Bank office, he and I got along really well, and he sent a man out to appraise it again. Well, the funny story on that was we got out there and I hadn't checked the gas in the pickup, and we got clear out there and ran out of gas, and we walked back across it, and he had dress shoes on, this guy did, and we walked through an area. He said, "My goodness, there's cactus here." So in the end, after got to know him in the long walk back and what happened, visiting and one thing and another, he went back and reappraised it for $45, and then we ended up buying it for that.
Right.
Then. So, but they wouldn't loan me any money.
Right.
And that's for this Henry Munderloh up there. He loaned me the money to buy it. And so...
Janet, I've heard you talk many times about feeding a crew at lunch. Was that any different or more challenging in any way going through the 80s, or did the farm crisis not really change the way you thought about that task?
Well, it was part of the package. The room and board was part of the pay for the men, and I was quite willing to do it. But as the money got tighter and tighter, we kept squeezing the household budget down a little more. And I was willing, but it was a challenge. Can't say we did without anything we needed. God provides in a number of ways.
Ate a lot of deer and antelope.
Well, yes. Well, but see, there was the provision. Yes. And he kept declaring how good it was, the best meat you could eat. Well, it was good.
Yeah.
And we ate it sometimes 3 times a day.
Yeah.
And I raised a garden. So, yes, it was a challenge because the men that were with us were too far from home to go home to mother. So it was 21 meals a week. And if we had a potluck someplace, it was 22 meals a week because they wouldn't come with us. But I learned to cook.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, no, I've eaten your cooking. You've definitely learned to cook. I mean, we made it to the 80s here in this journey of history, and we left a lot out, and there's a lot more history to cover. But I see you've got a guest here that your guy pulled in here just a second ago. So I don't know if there's any other major pieces you wanted to share or tell about, but I would be willing to make this part 1 if you wanted.
I don't know. Life just kept growing and evolving, and kids grew up.
Yeah,
and weren't kids anymore. So they had their careers and went off to college and
got an engineer and a vet and 2 ranchers. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you ever teach in Marine?
Yeah.
I taught a little bit of substitute work, and one year I taught a 50-day kindergarten. That was how long they gave the kindergarten, and that I just really loved.
I bet. Well, anyways, thank you guys for your time today. It was a joy. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Clay.
Really count that a privilege. Very good stuff. I mean, hour and some odd, 17 minutes I think we recorded there, and barely made it from 1950s to 1980. So Lots of history there still to be captured, and really looking forward to it. Next week, we will share another one of these with you with Spud Lemmel, kind of a local legend in my area, been on the land for a long time, and really, really excited to share that with you as well. Probably a couple of more of these coming up, and if others come in from other parts of the country, those might end up being bonus episodes at some point. But really look forward to sharing that with you next week on the Working Cows Podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.